Chapter 6. The following evening, around 10 o'clock, I was trying to decide whether to go to bed early or open a new bottle of scotch and make a night of it, when the telephone bell rang. The bell sounded shrill and urgent and startled me, probably because, up to now, the cabin had been as still and as silent as a poor relation at a wedding. I lifted the receiver. Hello? Above the faint humming on the line I could hear a dance band playing a waltz. The high notes of the muted trumpet suggested Glenn Booz's serenaders, that would make the call from the country club. Mr. Malloy? A woman's voice, pitched low with a little drawl in it. A voice calculated to stimulate male interest. At any rate, it stimulated mine. Speaking. My name is Serena Diedrich. I'm at the country club just now. Can you come over? I can offer you a job if you want it. I wondered why she couldn't have waited until the morning, but then the Diedrichs seemed to specialize in out-of-office hours. It didn't worry me. I wanted her custom. Certainly, Mrs. Diedrich. I'll be right over. Do I ask at the desk for you? I'll be in my car in the parking lot. It's a black cad. Will you be long? A quarter of an hour. I will wait that long, but no longer. The drawl had sharpened. I'm on my way. I began, but she had hung up. I went into the bathroom to inspect myself in the mirror, and decided I looked neat enough without being gaudy. As I straightened my tie, I wondered what she wanted. Probably some first-hand information about the kidnapping. From the pictures I had seen of her and from the sound of her voice, she wouldn't be satisfied with anything second-hand. I got the Buick out of the garage and drove fast up Rossmore Avenue that skirts the golf course, where a couple of cranks were trying to play golf in the moonlight with the aid of luminous balls. Turned left up Glendora Avenue and arrived at the imposing entrance of the country club with 4 minutes of the quarter of an hour in hand. The wooded gardens were ablaze with lights, and as I drove up the drive I could see a bunch of half-naked men and women clustered around the swimming pool, while Glenn Booz's serenaders played under the arc lights in a flower-decked alcove nearby. The car park was around the back of the clubhouse. I edged my way in, and parked in what seemed to be the only vacant space left. I got out, looked up and down the long rows of cars, and decided it would be easier to pick the needle out of the haystack than find one particular black cad. From this collection of luxury cars, there must have been over 300 of them, and probably a third of that number were Cadillacs. Parking lights flickered on and off, away to my left. I set off hopefully towards them. They continued to go on and off until I drew close enough to see they were attached to the glittering black car I had seen outside Ocean End 2 nights ago. I walked up to the car and looked in at the window. She was sitting behind the wheel, smoking a cigarette. The cold, hard light of the moon fell directly on her, and the first thing I noticed was the string of diamonds that flashed and sparkled like fireflies in her hair. The moonlight gave her a sculptured-in alabaster effect. She was wearing a low-cull strapless creation in gold lame, and she looked exactly what she was. The 4th richest woman in the world, from the diamonds in her hair to the cold, haughty expression on her rather long but distinctly lovely face. While I was looking at her and thinking she had the largest eyes I have ever seen and that her long and silky eyelashes were probably her own, she was looking at me. In the few seconds of silence that followed we sized each other up with frank curiosity. I have about a couple of minutes in hand, Mrs. Diedrich, I said. But even at that I seem to have kept you waiting. I'm sorry. Do you want to talk here or somewhere else? Where else is there? Well, there's a river view near the golf course that isn't bad. At least it's quiet. All right, we'll go there. She moved along the bench seat. Perhaps you'll drive. I got in under the steering wheel, switched on and trod on the starter. As I maneuvered the car out of the lot into the driveway, I gave her a quick glance. She was looking away from me, remote and thoughtful, her face as expressionless and as smooth as an ivory mask. I drove through the entrance gates, turned right, continued up the brilliantly lit avenue to the bridge, then swung the car onto the bridle path that led along the river. A few minutes more driving brought me to the spot I had in mind. I slowed down, turned the nose of the car to face the glittering moonlit river and parked. Except for the occasional croak of bullfrogs in the reeds farther up the river and the lap 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 of water against the bank, there was no sound to disturb us. "Do you want to get out?" I asked, breaking the silence that had brooded over us since we had driven from the club. She roused herself, as if her thoughts had been miles away, tossed her cigarette end into the river and shook her head. "No. We can talk here. It was you who found Suki, wasn't it?" "Yes. Have you any news of your husband?" "They phoned tonight. They want 500,000. They told me he was well and was looking forward to seeing me again." She spoke in a cold, flat voice that didn't quite conceal a frightened anxiety. "The money is to be paid the night after next, and he will be released as soon as they have it." I didn't say anything. After a long pause, she turned to look intently at me. "Someone has to deliver the money. I want you to do it. I'll pay you well." I was afraid she was going to say that. Dealing with kidnappers could be a dangerous business. More often than not, the stooge who hands over the ransom money gets himself knocked off. "Have you made any arrangements with them yet?" She shook her head. "This is only the opening move. The money is to be in used $20 bills. It is to be made up into 3 parcels, wrapped in oilskin. I shall get last-minute instructions where the money is to be delivered." She turned to look at me. "You're not frightened of the job, are you? I'll tell you that when I've heard what the arrangements are. Then you think it could be dangerous?" "It could be." She opened her handbag and took out a cigarette case. As she offered it, she said, her voice a little unsteady, "Do you think they'll send him back?" I took the cigarette, tapped it absently on my thumbnail before saying, "The possibilities are that they will." I lit her cigarette, and for some moments we smoked in silence. "I want you to tell me the truth," she said suddenly. "Will they send him back?" "I don't know. It depends if he's seen them. If he hasn't, then there's no point in not sending him back." "But if he has seen them?" "It depends on them. Kidnappers are about as ruthless as blackmailers, Mrs. Diedrich. Kidnapping carries the death penalty. They won't take chances. There's nothing I wouldn't do or pay to get him back. It's all my fault this has happened. If it wasn't for my money, he wouldn't have been worth kidnapping. He's got to come back." There was nothing I could think of to say to that. My own feeling was she had seen the last of him, anyway, alive. With all that money at stake, they were pretty certain to get rid of him. Most kidnappers prefer to kill rather than return. It is a lot safer for them. Too many kidnapped people in the past have given clues to the police that have led to the kidnappers being caught. "Have you consulted the police about this development?" I asked. "No. And I'm not going to. This man tonight said every move I make is being watched, and if I communicate with the police, Lee would be murdered. Besides, the police are useless. They haven't done a thing. We have time to set a trap. The money could be marked in a way no one would spot it. At least, it would give the police a chance to catch them after your husband's safe." "No," she said emphatically. I gave them my word not to try any tricks. If I did that, and they found out, and Lee suffered, I'd never forgive myself. I don't care a damn about the money. It's Lee I want. Who phoned you? Did you get an idea from his voice what kind of man he was? I mean, was he educated? Did he have an accent? Was there anything about his voice that you would recognize if you ever met him? I think he was talking through a handkerchief. His voice was very muffled. He didn't have an accent, but that's all I can tell you. Did he talk tough? Oh no. In fact, he was horribly polite. I stared thoughtfully at the river. Probably they had killed Diedrich as soon as they got him out of the house. They hadn't hesitated to kill his chauffeur, and they wouldn't hesitate to wipe me out after they had the money. It was a job I didn't want. She was smart enough to guess what I was thinking. If you don't do this, I have no idea who else to ask. I'll come with you if you will do it. Oh no, if I do it, I do it alone. There will be no question of that. I've made up my mind to see the money delivered to them with my own eyes. If you won't go with me, I'll go alone. I turned to look at her, surprised by her vehemence. We stared at each other for about 3 seconds. I could see by the expression in her eyes no one would make her change her mind. Well, all right, if that's how you feel about it, I said. I'll come with you. We sat for some moments in silence. There's one thing I wanted to ask you, she said abruptly. What was this woman like who said she was my secretary? You mean to look at? Yes. Well, she was about 30 or so, dark, good-looking and well-dressed. I thought at the time she didn't look like anyone's secretary. Was she very pretty? I suppose she was, and she had character too. She hadn't the usual vacant face of the usual pretty woman. She called my husband by his Christian name. Is that right? Yes. I saw her clench her fists. That fat fool of a policeman thinks Lee was having an affair with her, she said, and she seemed to be speaking through locked teeth. Do you think that? Does it matter what I think? I'm asking you. Do you think that? Her voice was harsh and tight with emotion. I don't know. I know nothing about your husband. It looks like it, but she may have just been a friend of his. He wasn't in love with her, she said so quietly I could scarcely hear her. I know it. He wouldn't have done a thing like that. He wouldn't have taken another woman into my home. He wasn't that type. She stopped, looked quickly away, her hand going to her face. Have the police found her yet? No, they're not trying to. They're so sure she's Lee's mistress. They say it's better not to find her. I don't believe it. She must know something. I didn't say anything. After a long, heavy silence, she said abruptly, perhaps you'll drive me back to the club. I don't think there's anything else to discuss until the night after next. Will you come to the house at 6? We may have to wait, but we must be ready to leave at a moment's notice. I'll be there. We drove to the club in silence. As soon as I parked the car, she got out and gave me a meaningless, automatic smile as she said, the night after next then, at 6. I watched her walk towards the clubhouse, a graceful, lovely figure in the gold dress, diamonds sparkling in her hair, fear and jealousy in her heart. Chapter 7. I toiled up the stone steps leading to Mifflin's small office on the 4th floor of police headquarters building. Mifflin was staring out of the window, his hat over his eyes, the stub of a cigarette stuck on his lower lip. He had a brooding, dismal look on his red face and his eyes showed the energy of his thoughts. You he said gloomily as I pushed open the door and edged my way into the small office. Funny thing, I was thinking about you. Come in and park. I'm out of cigarettes, so don't ask me for one. I pulled up a hard, straight-backed chair, sat astride it, and folded my arms along the back of it. How's the kidnapping going? Awful, he said, and sighed. Nothing to work on, and Brandon's going around like a fiend. He reckons someone will make him chief of police if he catches the kidnappers. I searched in my coat pocket, fished out a package of cigarettes, offered him one. We lit up and brooded at each other. Anything on the Jerome dame? Mifflin sighed. Have you come in here just to pick my brains? No, nothing like that. I came here to swap some information. Mifflin's face lit up and he gave me a quick, searching look. You got anything? Not much. It's confidential. Last night, Mrs. Diedrich called me up. You can guess what she wanted. She's got the ransom demand, and you're to deliver the dough, is that it? I nodded. She doesn't want the police to know. She wouldn't, Mifflin said, bitterly, but she expects us to get her husband back. When? Tomorrow night. They'll call her and give her final instructions. Brandon will have to be told. I shrugged. That's up to you. There's nothing he can do about it, unless he moves in and grabs the guy who collects. If he does, he'll kill Diedrich as if he shot him himself. It's my bet, Diedrich's dead already. Maybe, but we don't know for sure. Well, I'll have to tell him. So long as he doesn't let Mrs. Diedrich know I've been here. What will you do? Tap the telephone wire. Could do, Mifflin said, closed his eyes and frowned. If that woman doesn't want us in this, the chances are Brandon won't do anything. He's scared to make a wrong move with her. Once the ransom's paid, our troubles will be over. The Federal Bureau will take charge. Getting back to Mary Jerome. Anything or nothing. Brandon's leaving her alone, but I've traced her car. A patrolman spotted her coming from Ocean End and got the number. He's one of those freaks who remembers car numbers. He shoved in a report when he heard about the kidnapping. She rented the car from the Acme garage. Maybe you know the joint. It's run by a guy named Lute Ferris. We've had our eye on him off and on for smuggling reefers, but have never pinned anything on him. He was in Los Angeles when I called, but I talked with his wife. She remembers this Jerome dame. She arrived the night before last, the night of the kidnapping, around 8 o'clock and asked Lute for a car. She paid $50 deposit and said she needed the car for a couple of days. She gave the Orchid Hotel as her address. Trusting of Ferris to let her have a car without checking on her first, wasn't it? Why should he care? The car's insured. Anyway, that's the story, and we're stuck with it. You've checked the airport and the station to see if she came from out of town? Yeah, we've done that, but can't get a line on her. And that's as far as you've got? That's as far as we'll ever get, Mifflin said, stubbing out his cigarette. A kidnapping case is the worst kind of case you can get. If they knock off the guy who's kidnapped and the money ain't marked, you're up a tree. The only hope is for one of them to be dissatisfied with his cut and give the rest of them away. It makes it 10 times as hard now Brandon's scared to move. This Jerome dame is our only lead, and I can't go after her. Well, maybe you'll have another murder on your hands to cheer you up, I said bitterly. It wouldn't surprise me if I don't get knocked off tomorrow night. Mifflin eyed me thoughtfully. That's the only bit of good news I've had this week, he said. Yeah, come to think of it, It's an even bet that's what they'll do to you." I left him, rubbing his hands and whistling the Dead March in Saul. Chapter 8. Have you made a will? Jack Kerman asked as he watched me load a .38 from a box of shells on my desk. "I hope you've left me all your money. I can do with it. That redhead of mine seems to think I'm made of the stuff." "Do be quiet, Jack," Paula said sharply. She was trying not to show how worked up she was, but the worried expression in her eyes gave her away. "Haven't you any sense of decency?" "Oh, shut up, you two," I said, scowling at them. "You're giving me the shakes. Now, let's get this straight, Jack. The house will probably be watched, so you've got to keep out of sight. I'll let you know where we're going on my way out. Give us a good 5 minutes to get clear of the house, then follow on after us. Make certain no one sees you. We can't afford to slip up on this. Whatever you do, don't show yourself unless trouble starts, and then come out shooting." Kerman gulped. "What was that last bit again?" "I said come out shooting." "I thought that's what you said. Come to think of it, it mightn't be a bad idea if I made a will myself. And for the love of Pete, try to shoot straight," I went on, looked at my wristwatch, stood up and shoved the .38 into the shoulder holster under my coat. "We'd better get off. If you don't hear from either of us, Paula, by midnight, get on to Mifflin and tell him the tale." "She'll hear from me," Kerman said, looking worried. "Well, damn it, I hope she will." "Be careful, Vic," Paula said anxiously. I patted her shoulder. "I can't make you out. You worry over a little job like kidnapping, but think nothing of sending me into a room full of dope fiends. Be your age, Paula. Think of the money we're going to make." "Well, don't do anything silly," she said, trying to smile, "and for heaven's sake don't show off before that rich blonde." "You're making me nervous," I said. "Come on, Jack. Let's get out of here." Together we went along the corridor to the elevator. "Think we have time for a drink?" Kerman asked hopefully as we reached ground level. "No. But there's a pint in the car. And, Jack, don't make any mistakes. This might turn out to be a nasty job." Kerman gave an exaggerated shudder. "It's already nasty enough for me." He climbed into the back of the Buick and squatted down on the floor. I chucked a rug over him. "I'm going to love every minute of this," he said, poking his head out from the folds of the rug. "How long do you reckon I'll be under this lot?" "Oh, about 3 or 4 hours, not more. With the temperature in the 80s, that should give me some idea what the black hole of Calcutta was like." "It'll get cooler in the evening," I said heartlessly and started the car. "You have a whole bottle of scotch to help pass the time, only don't smoke." "Not smoke?" His voice shot up in a yelp of dismay. "Listen. Stop kidding yourself. If these guys find out you're in the back of the car, they'll steal up and slit your gizzard." That quietened him. I drove up the 2 miles of private road a lot more sedately than the first time I came this way. I took the bend in the drive nice and slow, and pulled up within a yard of the balustrade surrounding the courtyard. In the warm light of the evening sun, the house looked about as attractive as any house would look after $1 million had been spent on it. The big black Cadillac stood before the front entrance. In the middle distance 2 Chinese gardeners were picking the dead roses off an umbrella stand. They worked as if the rose tree was their main source of income for the next 9 months. Probably it was. The big swimming pool glittered in the sun, but no one swam in it. Across the expanse of velvety lawn in the lower garden, Below the terraces, 6 scarlet flamingos stood looking towards me, stiff-legged and crotchety, as unreal as the blue sky of an Italian postcard. There was everything to be had this day at Ocean End except happiness. I looked towards the house. The grass-green shutters covered the windows. A cream and green striped awning flapped above the front door. "Well, so long," I said in a low voice to Kerman. "I'm going in now. Have a lovely time." Kerman's voice was bitter from under the rug. "Don't stint yourself. Have plenty of ice with your drinks." I walked along the terrace and screwed my thumb into the bell push. I could see through the glass panels of the door into a big hall and a dim, cool passage that led to the back of the house. A tall, thin old man came down the passage and opened the front door. He looked me over in a kindly way. I had an idea he was pricing my suit and wishing he could buy me something a little better that wouldn't disgrace the house. But I was probably wrong. He may not even have been thinking about me. "Mrs. Diedrich is expecting me." "The name, sir?" "Malloy." He still stood squarely in the doorway. "Have you a card, please?" "Well, yes, and I have a birthmark too. Remind me to show it to you one of these days." He tittered politely like an aged uncle out to have fun with his sister's young hopeful. "So many gentlemen of the press have tried to see Mrs. Diedrich. We have to take precautions, sir. I had an idea I would be standing there till next summer if I didn't show him my card, so I got out my billfold and showed him my card. The non-business one." He stood aside. "Would you wait in the lounge, sir?" I went into the room where Suki had been shot. The Mexican rug had been cleaned. There were no bodies lying about this evening to welcome me. No untouched whiskey and soda. No cigarette stub to spoil the repaired surface of the table. "If you could sneak me a double scotch with a lot of ice in it, I'd appreciate it." "Certainly, sir." He drifted across the room to the sideboard on which stood a bottle of Haig and Haig, glasses, a bucket of ice and white rock. I listened attentively as he moved, but I couldn't hear his bones creak. I was surprised. He looked old enough for them to squeak. But, old as he was no slouch when it came to mixing a drink. He handed me one strong enough to tip over a pony and trap. "If you would care to look at some periodicals while you wait, sir, I will get some for you." I lowered myself into an easy chair that accepted me as if it was doing me a favor, stretched out my legs and balanced my drink carefully on the arm of the chair. "You think there'll be a long wait?" I asked. "I have no experience in these matters, sir, but it would seem likely they won't communicate with us until it is dark." He stood before me, not unlike one of the flamingos I had seen in the lower garden, and every inch of him dedicated to a life of service. Probably he would never see 70 again, but the blue eyes were still alert and clear, and what he lacked in speed he made up in experienced efficiency. A family retainer straight out of Hollywood, almost too genuine to be true. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Looks like a good 3-hour wait. Probably more." I dug out a package of cigarettes. He had a match flame ready before I got the cigarette into my mouth. "I didn't get your name." The grizzled eyebrows lifted. "Wadlock, sir. Do you work for Mrs. Diedrich or Mr. Marshland?" "Oh, Mr. Marshland, sir. I have been lent to Mrs. Diedrich for the time being, and I am very happy to be of service to her." "Have you been with the family long?" He smiled benignly. 50 years, sir. I was with Mr. Marshland Sr. for 20 years, and I have been with Mr. Marshland Jr. for 30 years. That seemed to put us on a friendly footing, so I asked, "You met Mr. Diedrich when he was in New York?" The benign expression went away like a fist when you open your fingers. "Oh, yes, sir. He stayed a few days with Mr. Marshland. I haven't seen him. I've spoken to him on the phone, and I've heard a lot about him, but there appears to be no photograph of him. What does he look like?" I had an idea there was disapproval in the blue eyes now, but I wasn't sure. "He is a well-built gentleman, dark, tall, athletic, with very good features. I don't think I can describe him any better than that, sir." "Did you like him?" The bent old back stiffened. "Did you say you would like some periodicals, sir? You may find the wait a little tedious." I had my answer. Obviously, for some reason or other, this old man had as much use for Diedrich as I had for a punch on the jaw. "That's all right. It makes a change to sit and do nothing." "Very good, sir." He wasn't friendly anymore. "I will let you know when there is any news." He went away on his spindly old legs, as dignified as an archbishop conferring a favor, and left me alone in a room full of bad memories. About a yard from my left foot, Suki's head had bled on the rug. Over by the fireplace stood the telephone into which Diedrich had breathed hurriedly and unevenly while he talked to me. I turned to stare at the casement window through which the kidnappers had probably come, gun in hand. A short, dapper figure in a white tropical suit and a Panama hat stood in the doorway, watching me. I hadn't heard him arrive. I wasn't expecting him. With my mind full of murder and thugs, he gave me a start that nearly took me to the ceiling. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said in a mild, rather absent-minded way. "I didn't know you were in here." While he was speaking, he came into the room and put his Panama hat on the table. I guessed he would be Franklin Marshland, and looked to see if Serena took after him. She didn't. He had a small, beaky nose, a heavy chin, dreamy, forgetful woman eyes, and a full, rather feminine mouth. His wrinkled face was suntanned, and the thick fringe of glossy white hair, above which was a bald, suntanned patch, made him look like a clean-shaven and amiable Santa Claus. I began to climb out of my chair, but he waved me to stay where I was. "Don't move. I'll join you in a whiskey." He consulted a narrow, gold wristwatch, worn on the inside of his wrist. 6:15. "I don't believe in drinking spirits before 6, do you?" I said it was a good rule, but rules should be broken now and then if one was to preserve one's sense of freedom. He paid no attention to what I was saying. There was a look of aloof disinterest on his face that hinted he seldom ever listened to anything anyone said to him. "You're the chap who's going to pay them the ransom money," he went on, stating a fact and not asking a question. I said I was, as he carried a fair-sized snifter to an armchair opposite mine. He sat down and stared at me over the rim of the glass the way you would stare at some curious animal at the zoo. "She tells me she's going with you." "So she says." "I wish she wouldn't, but nothing I say makes any difference." He sipped the whiskey, stared down at his white buckskin shoe. He had the smallest male feet I have ever seen. I never have been able to influence her one way or the other. A pity, really. Of course, old people are bores, but sometimes they are able to help the young if the young would only let them. I had the idea he was talking rather to himself than to me, so I didn't say anything. He brooded off into a silence that lasted some time. I helped myself to another of my cigarettes, kept an intelligent expression on my face just in case he might think it worthwhile to speak to me, and resisted the temptation to fidget. In the middle distance I noticed the two Chinese gardeners had decided to call it a day. They had been staring at the umbrella standard for some time without touching it. Now, having learned it by heart, they moved off to enjoy a well-earned rest. "Do you carry a gun?" Marshland asked suddenly. "Yes, but I don't expect to use it." "I hope not. You'll see she takes as little risk as possible, won't you?" "Of course." He drank half the whiskey. It didn't do much to cheer him up. These fellows have pretty big ideas. 500,000 is an enormous sum of money. He seemed to expect me to say something, so I said, "That's why they snatched him." "The risk is enormous too." "I suppose it is. Do you think they'll keep their side of the bargain?" "I don't know. As I explained to Mrs. Diedrich, if he hasn't seen them." "Yes, she told me. You're probably right. I've been reading about some of the famous kidnapping cases of the past years. It would seem the higher the ransom, the less likely is the chance of the victim surviving." I was suddenly aware that he wasn't mild or absent-minded anymore, and that he was staring at me with an intent, rather odd expression in his eyes. "It depends on the kidnappers," I said, meeting his eyes. "I have a feeling we shan't see him again." He got slowly to his feet, frowned round the room as if he had lost something. "Of course, I haven't said anything to her about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if they haven't already killed him." The white eyebrows lifted. "What do you think?" "It's possible. More than possible, perhaps?" "I'm afraid so." He nodded. The pleased, satisfied expression in his eyes jarred me to the heels. He went out of the room, very spry and dapper, and humming a tune under his breath. Chapter 9. It wasn't until the hands of my watch had crawled round to 11 that the telephone bell rang. The 5-hour wait had been interminable, and I was so het up I very nearly answered the telephone myself, but someone in some other part of the house beat me to it. I had been pacing up and down, sitting on the settee, staring out of the window and chain-smoking during those 5 long hours. I had seen Wadlock for a few minutes when he had brought me dinner on a wheel wagon, but he hadn't had anything to say and left me to serve myself. I had been out just after 8 o'clock to have a word with Kerman and to drop him a cold breast of chicken through the car window. I didn't stay more than a minute or so. I was scared anyone who might be watching the house would hear his flow of bad language. Now at last something was going to happen. Although Diedrich meant nothing to me, I was nervy after the long wait. I could imagine what Serena must be feeling like. She was probably fit to walk up a wall. A few minutes later I heard movements outside and I walked into the hall. Serena, in black slacks and a short, dark fur coat, came hurrying down the stairs, followed by Wadlock, who was carrying 3 oilskin-wrapped packages. She looked white and ill. There was a pinched, drawn look about her that told more clearly than words how she had suffered during those long hours of waiting. "Monte Verde mining camp. Do you know it?" she said in a low, unsteady voice. "Yes, it's on San Diego Highway. It'll take us about 20 minutes to get there if the traffic is light." Franklin Marshland appeared silently. "Where is it?" he asked. "Monte Verde mining camp. It's an old worked-out silver mine on San Diego Highway," I told him. "It's a good spot for them." I looked at Serena's white face. Her lips were trembling. "Any news of your husband, Mrs. Diedrich?" He is to be set free 3 hours after the money has been delivered. They will telephone us here where we will find him." Marshland and I exchanged glances. Serena caught hold of my arm. "Do you think they're lying?" If we let them have the money, we'll have no hold on them at all. You haven't a hold on them, anyway, Mrs. Diedrich. That's what makes kidnapping such a filthy business. You're entirely in their hands, and you just have to trust them. Wouldn't it be better, my dear, if you let Mr. Malloy delivers the money, and you wait here for the second message? Marshland asked. No. She didn't look at him. Serena, do be sensible. There's always a chance they might be tempted to kidnap you. I'm sure Mr. Malloy is quite capable. She turned on him, distraught with misery and hysteria. I'm going with him, and nothing you say will stop me, she cried wildly. Oh, you needn't pretend anymore. I know you don't want Lee to come out of this alive. I know you hate him. I know you've been gloating with joy that this has happened to him. But I'm bringing him back. Do you hear? I'm bringing him back. You're being absurd, Marshland said, a faint flush coming to his face. His eyes looked hard and bitter. She turned away from him to me. Are you coming with me? Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Diedrich. Then bring the money and come. She ran to the front door, jerked it open and went out onto the terrace. Wadlock gave me the 3 packages. You'll take care of her, sir, he said. I gave him a crooked grin. You bet. Marshland walked away without looking at me. She's very upset, sir, Wadlock murmured. He looked upset himself. I ran along the terrace, down the steps to the Cadillac. I'll drive, I said and tossed the packages into the back of the car. I won't be a moment. I want my gun. I left her getting into the cad, and ran over to the Buick. Monte Verde mine, I said. Give us 5 minutes, then come on, and watch out, Jack. A soft moan came from under the rug, but I didn't wait. I went back to the Cadillac and climbed under the steering wheel. Serena sat huddled up in a corner. She was crying. I sent the car shooting down the drive. Don't let it get you down. She went on crying quietly. I decided perhaps it was the best thing for her, and drove as fast as I could without taking risks, and ignored her. As we drove along Orchid Boulevard I said, better get hold of yourself now. You haven't told me yet what was said. If we make one false move, we may spoil his chance of getting back to you. These guys will be a lot more scared than we are. Now, come on, pull yourself together, and tell me. What did they say? It took her some minutes to control herself, and it wasn't until we were shooting up Monte Verde Avenue that she told me. The money is to be left on the roof of a shed standing before the old shaft. I don't know if you know it. I know it. What else? Each parcel is to be placed at least a foot apart and in a row. After we have placed the parcels we must leave immediately. That the lot? She gave a little shiver. Except for the usual threats about setting a trap. They didn't bring your husband to the phone? No. Why should they? Sometimes they do. The fact they hadn't made it look bad for Diedrich, but I didn't tell her so. Was it the same man who spoke to you before? I think so. The same muffled voice? Yes. All right, now this is what we do. I'll stop the car at the entrance to the mine. You stay in the car. I'll take the money and put it on the roof. You'll be able to see every move I make. I'll come straight back and get into the car. You will drive. At the beginning of Venture Avenue you'll slow down and I'll drop off. You carry on and get back to the house. Why are you dropping off? I may catch sight of them. No, she caught hold of my arm. Do you want them to kill him? We're leaving the money and doing what they tell us. You've got to promise. Well, all right, it's your money. If they double-cross you, you'll stand no chance of catching up with them. I'll guarantee they won't see me. No, she repeated. I'm not going to give them any opportunity to go back on the bargain. I swung the long black nose of the CAD into San Diego Highway. All right, but it's the wrong way to play it. She didn't answer. There was a lot of traffic belting along the highway, and it took me some minutes before I could swing the car across to the dirt track leading to the mine. We went bumping over the uneven surface of the track. It was dark and forlorn up there, and the headlamps bounced off great clumps of scrub and dumps of rubbish. Although only a few hundred yards or so off the main highway, once on this track it was as lonely and as dark as the inside of a tomb. Ahead of me was the entrance to the mine. One of the high wooden gates had been blown off its hinges. The other still stood upright, but only just. I pulled up before the gateway. The headlights sent a long, searching beam along the cracked concrete driveway that led directly to the head of the shaft. We could see the shed. It was not more than 7 feet high, a rotten, derelict building where probably at one time the timekeeper had sheltered while he checked in the miners. Well, that's it. Now you wait here. If anything happens, get out of the car and run for it. She was staring at the shed as if she expected to see Diedrich come out of it. Her face looked as if it was carved out of ice. I got out, opened the rear door and collected the 3 parcels. Holding them under one arm, I loosened the .38 in its holster and set off down the driveway towards the shed. Only the distant rumble of traffic on the highway disturbed the silence. Nothing moved. No one jumped out on me with a gun. It seemed a long way to the shed, and the brilliant headlamps made me a nice target for anyone with a trigger itch. I was glad when I got there. My right hand slid inside my coat and rested on the gun butt as I peered through the half-open door. Only a broken chair, a lot of dirt and scraps of paper on the floor greeted me. The headlights of the car went through the doorway and made 2 pools of light on the spider-infested wall. I was reluctant to leave all that money on the roof of the shed. I had a feeling Serena would never see it again, nor would she buy Diedrich back with it. But I had been hired to put the money there, so I put it there. I placed the packages along the rusty, corrugated roof in a row, spacing them carefully a foot apart as she had been instructed. There was nothing more to do. I would have liked very much to have hidden nearby and watched, but if I was spotted and Diedrich died, I would have his death on my conscience. She was right. Her one hope was to trust them to carry out their end of the bargain. I walked towards the car, my flesh creeping a little, still a target for anyone who wanted to shed a little blood. I wondered if they were watching. There were many number of places to hide in this ruined mine. I reached the Cadillac, jerked open the door and slid under the wheel. She was crying again. "If you're sure you don't want me to watch, I'll take you back," I said, not looking at her. "Take me back," she said in a muffled voice and turned away from me. As I drove through the gates I caught sight of a shadowy figure that ducked behind a pile of old railway sleepers. I thought it was Kerman, but couldn't be sure. If it was Kerman, he would probably hang around and see something. I looked quickly at Serena, but she was busy with her handkerchief and hadn't noticed anything. In a more optimistic mood I headed for Ocean End. Chapter 10. The hands of the clock on the mantelpiece showed 2:15. I sat alone in the lounge, nibbling at a whiskey and soda, staring at a silver and gold inlaid Mexican saddle that was hanging on the wall without particularly noticing it. Serena was upstairs somewhere. We had been waiting for 2.5 hours. A sudden soft whistle from behind me jerked me round eye and spilt my whiskey. "Lousy nerves you've got," Kerman said, coming in. "Is that whiskey you've spilt? There's plenty more. Help yourself. You look as if you could use it." "I can." He crossed to the wagon and mixed himself a long stiff drink. "Phew, think we'll get any sleep tonight?" "Never mind sleep. Did you see anything?" He flopped into an armchair opposite me. "No, at least I didn't see them, but I did see the money go." "But didn't you see who took it?" He shook his head. "The guy's smart, he kept hidden. I think he was probably standing on one of the girders that support the shaft head. It was pitch dark up there. Anyway, he must have been above the roof of the shed. He had a fishing rod. One of those deep-sea rods, I should imagine. It would have to be something pretty hefty to take the weight of those parcels. He just dropped a hook on the parcel and fished it off the roof into the darkness. I never heard a sound or caught a glimpse of him. It was damned spooky seeing those parcels take off in the moonlight until I tumbled to what he was doing." "Yes, that's smart. Did he see you, Jack?" "Not a chance." "Don't be too sure. I saw you. I'll bet my life you didn't. Besides, I didn't arrive until you were driving away. I saw your taillights, and when I reached the mine I was crawling around like a red Indian." "Well, I saw someone as I was leaving. It couldn't have been me." I tried to remember what the shadowy figure had looked like. It had certainly reminded me of Kerman, so that would make it tall, broad-shouldered and lean. Not much to go on, but something. Must have been one of the gang. I wish I had seen more of him. I looked at my wristwatch. In another quarter of an hour we should hear, if we're going to hear. Kerman rubbed weary knuckles into his eyes. "I feel whacked. That 5-hour wait in the car nearly killed me. Think they'll turn him loose?" "I don't know. I can't see them doing it. It'll be a lucky break for him if they do." "Brandon's going to love this if he doesn't come back," Kerman said, stifling a yawn. "It's her responsibility. But we are accessories. He'll be scared to curse her, but he'll have something to say to us." "Well, let him say it," I said, got up and tramped across to the wagon to make another drink. My hand hovered over the bottle as Franklin Marshland came silently into the room. "So you've got back safely," he said. I must say I was very worried. He looked inquiringly at Jack Kerman. I introduced them. "A very long, unpleasant wait," Marshland went on. "Surely it's time they communicated with us?" "It needs 5 minutes to the 3 hours," I said, giving Kerman another drink and going back to the settee. "If they've released him, they'll make sure he doesn't get back here until they are well out of town." He half turned to stare at me. "I think it's extremely unlikely they will release him," he said. "If we don't hear in another half hour, I propose calling the police." "That's up to you," I said, "but as we've waited so long, I think we should wait until daylight. Even now any false move might be dangerous for him. I think he's dead." I felt tired, and beyond making aimless small talk. "Just what is it you dislike so much about Lee Diedrich, Mr. Marshland?" He ignored this question, and stepped out onto the terrace. He remained out there for 3 or 4 minutes, then came in again and headed for the door. "I'd better see how my daughter is," he said, more to himself than to us. "This wait is very hard on her." At the door he paused, looked back at me. "A man who marries a woman for her money is always worthy of contempt, Mr. Malloy." He went out of the room, and we listened to his footsteps on the stairs. Herman made a grimace. "Did he marry her for her money?" he asked in a whisper. "I don't know." I jerked my thumb at the clock. 5 minutes overdue. "Doesn't look very healthy, does it?" "There's nothing we can do except wait." I swung my legs up on the settee. "I like that girl. Maybe she is a little over-rich and probably spoiled, but she's got a tender heart." Herman grunted. "I like him hard and shiny," he said, and closed his eyes. Minutes ticked by. We began to doze. We finally slept. The first rays of the morning sun brought me upright with a start. I looked at the clock. It showed 6:45. Herman slept soundly. I heard no sound except the gentle beating of the surf on the low ridge of coral stone that made a natural harbor at the end of the garden. I swung my legs off the settee and walked on to the terrace. The 2 Chinese gardeners were at work, staring at the umbrella standard. The flamingos were grouped around the lily pond, hunting up some breakfast on a balcony at the far end of the terrace. Serena Diedrich, still in her black slacks and her short fur coat, sat staring out to sea. There was a lost look on her white face. A look that told me no one had telephoned while we slept, and no one had sent him back. I walked quietly into the lounge and left her alone with her misery. Chapter 11. The next 4 days were a sustained and shattering bedlam that shook the usually placid, unruffled calm and quiet of Orchid City to its foundations. When the news broke that $500,000 had been paid to a gang of kidnappers and the kidnapped man had not been returned, the country as far north as San Francisco and as far south as Los Angeles sprang into action. For the first few hours, Brandon had it all his own way and reveled in the commotion. He began to organize what was to be the greatest manhunt of the century, but he had scarcely begun to issue orders when a dozen sharp-eyed federal agents descended on him from San Francisco and snatched away his command. State troopers, regular army units, aircraft, television and the radio were pressed into service. Herman and I spent hours at police headquarters being questioned and cross-questioned by a furious, purple-faced fist-pounding Brandon, and later by 2 quiet federal agents who took us apart, laid us on the desk, poked us about with long inquisitive fingers, and weren't over fussy how they put us together again. We were bullied and threatened and cursed. We had fists shaken in our faces. Necks swelled. Eyes turned bloodshot and spittle flew in all directions with the intensity of trying to get a clue out of us. But we hadn't a clue to give out. I couldn't move 10 yards on the streets without some visiting pressman letting off a camera in my face. Herman, described as the man who saw the ransom taken, was badgered from dusk to dawn for his autograph, his nail parings, locks of his hair and clippings from his suit by wild-eyed, sensation-hungry souvenir seekers until he was scared to leave the safety of the office. The massive gates of Ocean End were closed. The telephone was disconnected. A quiet, deathly hush hung over the place. Rumor had it that Serena Diedrich had collapsed and was seriously ill. All day long aircraft circled overhead, searching the sand dunes, the foothills and the approaches of the city. Every road was patrolled. A house-to-house inquiry was set on foot. Suspicious characters were rounded up and questioned. A squad of police went into Coral Gables, the East End district of the city, and checked over the more disreputable inhabitants. The activity was enormous, but for all the efforts made by the federal agents, the police, state troopers, the army and hundreds of amateur investigators, neither Lee Diedrich the kidnappers were found. Then, on the 5th morning, Serena snapped out of her grief and took a hand in the hunt herself. It was announced through the press and over the radio that she would pay a $20,000 reward to anyone giving information that would lead to the arrest of the kidnappers, and a $1,000 reward for any information remotely connected with kidnapping. The result of this announcement turned practically every citizen, except the wealthy, into amateur detectives and made Orchid City a temporary hell on earth. It was on the 6th night after the ransom had been paid that I let myself into my quiet little cabin, thankful to get away from the strident hubbub of the hunt, with the intention of locking the door and getting myself a little peace and an early night in bed. My cabin is situated in the sand dunes, facing the sea, and is a quarter of a mile from the nearest house. It has a small weed-infested garden which I pay Tony, my good-for-nothing houseboy, to keep neat. A veranda with faded sunblinds, one big living room, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom and a kitchen big enough to swing a cat in, providing it is a Manx cat. The charm of the place to me is that it is lonely and quiet and you can't hear anyone's radio and you can sing in your bath without getting a brick through your window. But because it is so isolated, it is also an ideal spot for anyone who wants to slit my throat. My yells for help would be as futile as a short-tempered man trying to slam a revolving door. I was sinking the key in the lock when I heard a soft footfall behind me. Normally my nerves will pass in a crowd with a light behind them, but the excitement and strain of the past 5 days had made them a little edgy. I swung around with a quick intake of breath to find a shadowy figure right on top of me. The right-hand punch that automatically started got no more than halfway when I saw that my visitor was a woman. I lowered my fist, gulped in a little of the hot night air and said as even as I could, "Must you sneak up like that and scare me out of my wits?" "Your name Malloy?" I peered at the slim figure before me. It was too dark under the veranda roof to see much of her, but what I could see appeared to be worth looking at. "Yeah, who are you? I want to talk to you. Let's go in where we can park." As I led the way into the main room, I thought it was a pity she had a voice hard enough to crack a rock on. We stood in the darkness, close together while I groped for the light switch. I found it, thumbed it down and looked into a pair of wide brown eyes that knew all the answers and most of the questions too. She was around 24 or 5 and dark. Her thick glossy hair was parted in the middle and framed a face of standard prettiness that was a shade paler than it should have been and too hard and bitter for the number of years she had been using it. Her over-bright red lips, put on square, and the faint smudges under her eyes gave her a sexy look that would make men stare at her and wonder, but probably they'd get no farther than wondering. Her figure under the fawn and green silk windbreaker and the high-waisted slacks was good enough to advertise the best foundation garment in the business. "Hello," I said, staring at her. "Sure it's me you want?" "If your name's Malloy, I'm sure," she said, and moved past me to the fireplace. She faced me, her hands thrust deep into her trouser pockets, her eyes searching my face. "Nick Pirelli told me to come to you." "Why, sure," I said, and looked sharply at her, wondering who she was. "Has he been sandbagging anyone recently?" "No, but he's in trouble," the girl said. She took out a crumpled package of Lucky Strike, flicked one into her mouth, scratched a match alight with her thumbnail and set fire to the cigarette. "He's been pinched for the Diedrich snatch." In the pause that followed, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked busily and the refrigerator in the kitchen gave an irritable grunt. The girl continued to watch me, not moving, her head tilted a little on one side so the smoke of her cigarette wouldn't get into her eyes. "Pirelli?" I said, as blank as I sounded. She nodded. He said you were a bright boy. Well, go ahead and be bright. Someone's got to be if he's going to beat this rap. When did they take him? An hour ago. She glanced over her shoulder to look at the clock. An hour and 5 minutes to be exact. The feds? She shook her head. A smooth, well-dressed fatty and a couple of hard-faced dicks. There were 2 bulls outside with the car. Was it Brandon? Short, fat, white-haired? That makes him Brandon. Who's he? Captain of police. She drew on her cigarette, examined her nails and frowned. I didn't know police captains made arrests. They do when there's a lot of money hanging to the pinch, and a lot of juicy publicity as well. Besides, Brandon would want to get in front of the feds. Well, he's got in front of them. She moved away from the fireplace and sat down on the divan. Nick said you'd get him out of it. Can you? I don't know. I owe him something, and if there's anything I can do, I'll do it. What does he expect me to do? He didn't say. He was a little rattled. I've never seen Nick rattled before. When they found the gun, he told me to come to you. I went to a cupboard, took out a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses and set them on the table. I fetched a jug of ice water from the refrigerator. Let's start from the beginning. It'll be quicker that way. Do you like your whiskey straight or with water? For a bright boy, you haven't much imagination. Right now they're beating his brains out. Do you think I want to drink whiskey when I know that's going on? I made myself a stiff drink and sat down. You don't know for certain, and worrying about it won't help him. She jumped to her feet and took 3 or 4 quick paces across the room, turned and went back to the divan. She sat down again and began to pound her fist into the palm of her hand. Who are you, anyway? I asked. Myra Teresa, Nick's girl. All right, now let's take a look at it. Give me the details, but make it fast. I arrived with them, she said, and went on practically in one breath. Nick and I were going to the movies. He was late. I phoned and he said to come over while he changed. I went over. I rode up in the elevator with the 3 of them. I knew they were cops. We got off at the 4th floor, and I let them go ahead. When they turned the corner, I went after them. They were standing outside Nick's door. 2 of them had guns in their hands. I watched. They didn't notice me. The fat one rapped on the door. I guess Nick thought it was me. They jumped him, and had the cuffs on before he knew what had hit him. Then they started to ransack the place. The front door was pushed to, but not closed. I looked in. Nick was standing by the wall watching them take the place to pieces. He looked my way and made motions for me to keep out of the way. I stuck around, watching. Then they found the gun down the side of the settee. Brandon got awfully excited. He said it was the gun that had killed Diedrich's chauffeur. Nick got rattled then. He and I play cards for a living. We can lip read. It helps when the cards don't fall right. He told me to come to you. I left them shouting at him. How did Brandon know the gun killed Diedrich's chauffeur? I asked. She shook her head. I don't know. What happened then? I waited across the other side of the street. After about half an hour, they brought him out. He could scarcely walk, and there was blood on his face and his clothes. She got up to grind the cigarette out in the ashtray. They took him away in a police car. Then I came on here. I sat staring at her for a second or so. Do you know anything about the kidnapping? The brown eyes met mine. Only what I've read in the papers. Nothing else? No. Does he? No. He wouldn't touch a thing like that. All right, maybe we are a little tricky with a deck of cards, but that's as far as we go. Has he ever been caught? Her eyes hardened. Now and then. Has he a police record? I guess so. He drew 2 years in San Francisco. He hasn't been out more than 4 months. Anything before that? You want to know a lot, don't you? I want to know his record. If it's important. 6 months, a year and 2 years. Spread over 8 years. Card sharping? She nodded. Did he ever hurt anyone with that cosh of his? No one's ever complained. You're quite sure about the kidnapping? You don't think he pulled it without telling you? He didn't do it. It's not his line. Can't you understand that? I decided to believe her. All right, I'll see what I can do. I reached for the telephone and dialed a number. After a while a polite voice said, "This is Mr. Franken's residence." Mr. Franken in? This is Vic Malloy. Yes, sir. I'll put you through. After more delay, Franken came on the line. Hello. What's on your mind? An hour ago, Brandon, with a couple of dicks, picked up a guy named Nick Pirelli at his apartment on Jefferson Avenue. They searched the rooms and found a gun. Brandon said it was the gun that had killed Lee Diedrich's chauffeur. They've arrested Pirelli for the Diedrich kidnapping. I want you to represent him, Justin. Expense no object, and I want you to get over to headquarters and look after him. They're pushing him around and I want it stopped. Will you do it? Has he anything to do with the kidnapping? I don't know. His girl, who ought to know, says he hasn't. It looks like a frame to me. Brandon couldn't know the gun was the death gun by just looking at it. He either brought it with him and planted it or he's guessing. You can't say a thing like that. Franken's voice was shocked. Off the record I can. It would be a terrific boost for Brandon if he could crack this case and steal a march on the feds. I wouldn't put anything past him. Who is Pirelli, anyway? He's a card sharper with a record. That doesn't help. What's he to you? He did me a good turn once. As a personal favor, Justin, I want you to get down there right away and stop them working on him. There was a long pause on the line while he chewed it over. I didn't hurry him. Finally, he said, I'm not sure I want this job. Brandon must have something more solid to work on than the gun. Maybe he has, but that isn't the point. You're not going to let him hang something on this guy just because he's got a record, are you? Well, no. All right, Vic, I'll go over there and see him. But I warn you, if I think he's guilty, I'm pulling out. There's too much publicity tied to this business to be in on the losing end. I still think it could be a frame. Take a look at him, anyway. And don't worry too much about what they've got on him. I'm going to take a hand in this, Justin. Well, all right, I'll see what I can do. Better see me tomorrow morning at my office. I'll ring you tonight. I hung up before he could protest. Myra was watching me, an intent expression in her eyes. Who's that? Justin Franken, the smartest criminal lawyer on the Pacific Coast. If he believes Pirelli is being framed, he'll never stop fighting until he's freed him. Is he going down there? You bet he is, and he'll block Brandon off. She lit another cigarette. Her hand was noticeably unsteady. I guess Nick knew what he was doing when he told me to come to you. From her that would be praise. I finished my drink and stood up. Where can I reach you? 245 Monte Verde Avenue. It's a little green painted shack on the left-hand side as you go up. I live alone. While I was writing the address down, she went on, "This will take some money, won't it?" I told Pirelli I'd be glad to help him any time, and it'd be on the house. That still goes. Thanks. Forget it. I owe him a stab in the belly. Now look, I'm going down to police headquarters right away. There's not much I can do until I find out just how much they have on him. I might even have a word with him if I'm lucky. You mean they'll let you talk to him? I don't know. The homicide lieutenant is a friend of mine. He might swing it. Just for a second the hardness went out of her eyes, and the red-painted mouth trembled. "Give him my love," she said,